teaches creative writing at UW-Waukesha, and so she's agreed to talk a little bit about the writing process and what it's like to get published and all of that, in addition to doing a reading. So if you could just join me in giving her a real warm welcome.
So thanks so much to all of you for coming. Thank you, Melissa, for that really lovely introduction, as well as inviting me to visit your library. I'm so happy to be here with you guys. I thought I'd start off by telling you a little bit about the repeat year and my inspiration for writing it, what my writing process is like, and then my journey to publication. I'd also like to read you a brief excerpt from the novel, and then I would be happy to take any questions you have at the end, as well as signed copies of the book. They are available for sale at the back of the room. We did not put a sign up. They're $16, in case you were wondering. So let me tell you a little bit about the repeat year. It's the story of Olive Watson, a young intensive care nurse who wakes up on New Year's Day to find herself reliving the previous year. With this unique insight, she must navigate the prior year's challenges and mistakes, lost patients, an affair that ended a committed relationship, and the remarriage of her mother. Olive's path intersects with Sherry Whitten, a 58-year-old eccentric who turns out to be an experienced repeater and an unlikely mentor with her own demons to face. So I'm a writer who usually starts off with a premise or a what-if question. In this case, my what-if question was, what if a person was given an opportunity to relive a year of their life? Would that person want to take advantage of the year, try to fix their mistakes, and rewrite history? Or would they stay set in their ways and stick to the same path they were on? I think that most of us can agree that this maybe sounds like a fascinating novel premise, but it's probably not something that we would want to experience. I know I wouldn't. I think it would be really frustrating and exhausting. I came up with this premise several years ago and jotted it down in my idea notebook, but I didn't come back to it until I was in MFA school at the University of Michigan in 2006. At that point, I was ready to tackle this novel, and I finally had the right character for the premise. I wanted my protagonist to be an everyday heroine, someone with everyday challenges, decisions, and mistakes that readers could really relate to. I didn't want Olive to be a character who had blatantly obvious and easy mistakes to fix. The movie Groundhog Day is often compared to the premise of the repeat year. And though I really do love that movie, and I think it's really funny, its main character, Phil Connors, played by Bill Murray, has a pretty easy fix to stop reliving the day. He just has to stop being such an arrogant jerk. So I wanted Olive to be a more likable, yet flawed, nuanced character. It's not immediately obvious what she needs to change at first. I also wanted to avoid her having any superhero moments where her foreknowledge could prevent, say, an assassination, a major historical event, or a tragedy, which I think has been done many times before. As I mentioned, I wrote the first draft of the repeat year in graduate school. I was very fortunate to have the funding, support, and time to devote to mostly my own writing. I didn't write from an outline. I basically just dove right in and submitted piecemeal chapters to my writer's workshop as I wrote them. My cohort and instructors were really helpful and gave me constructive criticism in this early stage. By the time I graduated from the University of Michigan in 2008 with my MFA, I had a solid draft of the repeat year, which had already undergone some revisions. For example, I changed Olive's job to an intensive care nurse. It required me to do more research, but ultimately I feel like it really shaped her as a character, and her experiences resonated more with the premise of the repeat year, because she could have repeat patients and be faced with ethical dilemmas. At this point, I moved back to Wisconsin to be with my husband and started teaching English at the University of Wisconsin-Waukesha. I started submitting the repeat year to agents for representation, and I got a lot of interest. Many requested the manuscript to read, but their answer ultimately was always the same. I'm sorry, it's not right for my list. This was really disheartening. Like most writers, I had hoped that I'd need to query only 1 or 2 agents before finding the one. A few agents gave me editorial comments and offered to read a revision. Some of the comments weren't helpful at all, but others were really insightful, and I tried to incorporate those into my draft. At this time, I was teaching writing full-time, so it was hard for me to carve out much time for my own writing. I would mostly get revision done during the university's winter break in January and over the summer. During the school year, I was buried with student essays and stories to read and grade. After several major revisions of the repeat year and even more rejections from agents, I was starting to lose hope of it ever being published. Many of my friends and family encouraged me to set it aside for a while and try to write something new. I agreed to do that, but with a heavy heart, but not before trying one more batch of agents' queries I hadn't tried yet. I bought a copy of the Writer's Digest Guide to Literary Agents and decided to query every agent who represented my type of fiction from A to Z. And once I got to the end, if I still hadn't found an agent, I would move on to a new project. I got to F, Fine Print Literary Management, when I finally found my wonderful agent, Stephanie Evans. We signed a contract in December 2011, and she sold it to Berkeley Books, an imprint of Penguin, 2 months later. My editor didn't ask me to do many edits. With the exception of moving the year, Olive was reliving from 2006 to 2011 to make it more timely, so ultimately all my revisions paid off in the end. My writing process with my second novel in progress has been very different. I feel like I learned a lot more about the novel writing process and what works best for me. I did a lot more planning and thinking about it before I dove into the drafting. I had a very long file of character notes and plot points before I set about writing it. My teaching full-time has forced me to really immerse myself in my writing when I have the time off. I feverishly pounded out the draft last summer and pretty much wrote from 9 to 5 every day. I've had trusted friends read it and give me feedback, as well as my agent, and I'm really looking forward to working on some revisions this summer after my book tour. So now I'd like to read to you from an excerpt from the repeat year. I'm going to read to you from chapter 4. In this scene, 2 days have already passed since New Year's Day, and Olive is still trying to wrap her head around what the heck is going on. After a long day of work in the ICU, she comes home to find Sherry Whitten, an acquaintance of her mom's, in her apartment. They have an awkward exchange before it becomes clear that Sherry is there for a very important reason. It's not just a feeling, Olive. It's real. You've already lived through 2011. I have too, and I remember all 365 days of it. But here I am back at the beginning. Here we are, I should say. Olive nodded, not trusting her voice. The mixture of relief and vindication she'd been expecting to feel, to have someone else acknowledge this bizarre occurrence, did not come. Instead, to hear it spoken aloud by someone like Sherry Whitten, no less, made the whole thing seem like an elaborate hoax. She felt inexplicably defeated. I went to bed in December 2011 and woke up the next day in January 2011, Olive mused aloud. She knew there was no taking it back now that she had spoken it in Sherry's presence. She had chosen her side, or rather, her side had been chosen for her, the surreal side, Sherry Whitten's side. So I thought. Sherry nodded again with her magisterial grace. She removed her fringed shawl and spread it across her lap like a blanket. Underneath, she was wearing a white blouse with lace detailing on the collar and sleeves. Are there other people? Do you know why this happened? What are we supposed to do? Sherry held up her hands as though to dam up the flood of questions. Her left hand was bare, Olive noticed, no wedding ring. She had heard from her mom that Sherry had been married something like 3 or 4 times. On her right hand was a thick-banded gold ring with a garnet the size of a grape. Slow down. I've got a lot to tell you, and I don't want to leave anything out, Sherry said. I should start by telling you that this isn't my first time. You mean you've lived this year over more than once already? Olive asked in disbelief. She saw the past year loop before her eyes continuously, over and over again, like the reel of a movie. She imagined 2011 was a trap. Perhaps, one by one, everyone would fall into it until the history of the world repeated and erased itself at the start and end of every year, always the same year, 2011. Or maybe it was just she and Sherry stuck here while everyone else marched forward. Sherry held up her bare left hand again to silence Olive. No, not 2011. This is my first time repeating it, same as you. What I meant was I've repeated other years in the past. My first was 1982, and then 1997. I had to repeat 2005 twice. You had to live the same year 3 times, Olive asked. She felt a little lightheaded at the prospect. Why did you have to do that one over again and not the others? Calm down, calm down. You look like you're going to faint. Why don't I get us something to drink? Is it okay if I do that? Sherry looked fuzzy and pixelated as she walked to the kitchenette. Olive rested her head against her knees. 3 times? How many additional years had Sherry lived total? 4 years? This would be Sherry's 5th repeat. Would Olive have the same fate? For heaven's sake, she heard Sherry say from the kitchen area, you've only got beer and diet soda in here. How do you kids live? No milk? No orange juice? Olive heard the wooden rattle of drawers and cupboards opening and closing. Don't you have any tea? Sherry called. I don't drink tea, Olive called back. She had to lift her head momentarily from her knees to respond. My roommate does, though. There might be some in the silverware drawer. You can make some for yourself, but I don't want any. Sherry stood before her shortly, holding 2 mugs. One of them was a novelty mug that read, "You are dumb." The other was a global warming mug that had a map of the world drawn on it. When you poured a hot beverage in it, some of the land disappeared. Olive chose global warming. The bitter smell of green tea rose up from it. She watched as Florida vanished. Thanks. I don't really like tea, though, she said, and bent down to untie her tennis shoes. Sherry resumed her spot on the couch. You should try it. It will make you feel better. I've tried tea before. It's not really my thing, Olive protested, but she took a small sip to show Sherry she was appreciative of her efforts. The green tea looked and smelled like what she imagined urine would look and smell like after someone had eaten large quantities of grass. Perhaps the tea even tasted like it, although she had no proof to back this up. Yeah, it's still not my thing. She pulled out the drawer of the coffee table and extracted 2 sandstone coasters. She set her mug down on one of them and laid the other within Sherry's reach. See, you look like you're feeling better already. I'm eager to hear what you have to say about this. She interrupted herself, not sure what to call it. Phenomenon, time warp, miracle, curse, this. She kicked her tennis shoes under the coffee table. I knew you would be, so let's see. Where to start? I've never done this before. Sherry looked pleased with her role as storyteller. I've met only one other person who's repeated a year before, at least in the 30 years I've known about it. There could have been people in my childhood and adolescence who were experiencing the same thing, but I wasn't aware of it. The one other person I met was my first husband's boss, the district attorney. But he wasn't very receptive to my conversation. It was my first time in '82, and I had just as many questions for him as you have now. How did you know he was living the same year over? Olive asked. My husband Clyde kept making comments about him at home. Gene McGregor was his name. I guess in meetings he would hint at the fact that he could predict the outcome of a trial and was insistent on the fact that if they didn't do A, B, and C, they would fail. In theory, this doesn't sound that strange for an arrogant lawyer, but Clyde and some of his coworkers suspected something else was at work. They began to wonder if Gene was getting outside information and, in effect, working with the defense. There was one particular case in March of that year that Clyde told me about. Gene was in a frenzy trying to convince his staff that the evidence wouldn't hold in court and that they needed to come up with some other tactic. Clyde went out to a bar with Jean one night, and Jean confessed that if he lost this case, he knew he would never find rest, and claimed he would be stuck in the purgatory of this year all over again. After Clyde relayed this to me, clearly thinking that his boss had lost it, I decided to seek Jean out and confirm if my suspicions were accurate. It took a great deal of courage for me to go over to his house. I was only a little older than you at the time. Jean answered the door, completely plastered. We had met briefly at the office Christmas party, but he couldn't conceive why one of his employees' young wives was visiting him at his home. I tried to talk to him about the big case he was working on, but he became really angry, saying that Clyde shouldn't be sharing confidential issues with me. I tried to placate him, and he invited me inside for a drink, asked me if I was lonely because Clyde was working late. I realized I had better articulate myself more clearly, so I was very blunt with Jean. I asked him if he was reliving 1982. I could tell from his shocked expression that I had hit the nail on the head, but he didn't want to admit it. He told me he would blow his head off if he had to live 1982 over again. I asked him if he thought failing to put an evil man behind bars had been the impetus for his repeated year, if it was the event he needed to correct before moving on, that was my theory of how things worked. He laughed at me and told me I was delusional. I was barely out the door when he came out onto the front lawn and asked me what I supposed he should do to change the course of the year. I told him I didn't know, but I thought winning the trial would be a good start, although it couldn't hurt to focus on improving other aspects of his life as well. So did he make it to 1983? Olive asked. He did, but I'm not sure how long it took him to get there. I cornered him at the office Christmas party and asked him to contact me on New Year's Day, but he didn't. I was too afraid to go back to his house, so I called him at the office. He acted like he hardly remembered me, like it had been years since we'd talked, not just days. He wouldn't tell me for sure, but I think it had been years for him. She turned to Olive as if suddenly remembering her presence. But that won't happen to you. Jean was an anomaly. He was a pretty awful man, and you know what? They never won that trial. But Olive was still trying to wrap her head around the idea of the lawyer existing in some sort of alternate reality as the rest of the world, Sherry included, had sped past him. Years of his life condensed into mere minutes for everyone else. But didn't you just say you had to live 2005 over twice? She asked. Don't focus on that, Sherry said. She tapped a spoon against her mug. The sound rang out like a chiming bell. It will only make things worse. You have to focus on the big picture, the reason for the repeat year. So what you're saying is that the essential idea behind reliving this year is to correct something we did wrong last year? Perhaps Olive hadn't been far off the mark yesterday when she'd supposed that she'd done something seriously wrong last year to deserve this fate. That was my theory, Sherry said. But it's not quite as simple as that. If every time someone made a mistake, they had to relive that year, we'd all be in the same boat. We'd all probably still be in the Stone Age because we wouldn't be able to progress further than that. But as far as I can tell, there are only a few of us having these experiences. Perhaps it's some kind of major mistake we made that affects the outcome of the world? Olive offered, feeling sheepish immediately after the question escaped her mouth. Sherry's thin, pink lips stretched into a wry smile. That thought had crossed my mind too, delusions of grandeur. But I don't think we're here to assassinate any villains or warn anyone of meteors hurtling toward the earth. We're not superheroes, we're still us, just with a little extra knowledge. And the things I changed, well, it's still not obvious to me how to go about this year, even though this will be my 5th go of it. Really? What have you changed? I set myself up for that one. Sherry's lips straightened into a stern line. I want to help you through this, but you have to understand that this doesn't make us instant bosom buddies. She draped her silk shawl around her shoulders, and Olive thought she saw the return of the Sherry Whitten she knew from parties, serious and aloof, with an almost accusatory stare. If you could just give me a ballpark idea, Olive pressed. I'm sure you've heard rumors about my illustrious track record. Sherry gave her shoulders a slight shake as though awakening herself. I'm probably the worst guide you could have through this. I obviously haven't learned my lesson. I've had to do this so many times. That means you've had a lot of experience, Olive said gently. I'm just happy to have someone to confide in. So you haven't tried to talk to anyone else about it? Sherry asked. When Olive nodded, she continued, That's good. I made the mistake of trying to tell my second husband about it, and I ended up spending the whole year in therapy, which was helpful, don't get me wrong, but not really the issue at hand. Yeah, I think my ex-boyfriend thinks I'm a little nuts, too. I was so disoriented when I woke up at his apartment on New Year's Day. We hadn't seen each other in months, and then all of a sudden, we're back together. Sherry traced the mug's rim with her fingers. She seemed to be waiting for Olive to expand on her situation. Olive looked down. 2 large pockets were sewn along the bottom of her scrub top. The left one was starting to sag and detached from the weight of the instrument she carried with her all day. A pocket-sized procedures and pharmaceutical guide, hemostats, bandages, ibuprofen for her, the Motorola, pens. Her pocket would soon be hanging on by a thread. How could Sherry assert her own desire for privacy in one breath and then give Olive such a look that demanded Olive's life story? It seemed an unfair expectation. She felt reluctant to admit any of the secrets that might have helped to land her here. We'd been dating for over 3 years, and we broke up last February, she finally said. Ah, Sherry said. She set her cup of tea on the coaster. We had a big fight, and then we're on a kind of break, and She couldn't form the words. Unspoken, they tasted acidic on her tongue. The burning sensation spread to her sinuses, and without warning, she began to cry. It was woefully inappropriate. Sherry Whitten was the last person on earth in front of whom she wanted to lose it. She grabbed for the tissue box on the end table, but it was empty. I'm sorry, I don't know why. For heaven's sake, Sherry said, but her voice was kind, motherly. She handed Olive a handkerchief that smelled of men's cologne. You're doing all right. You're handling this quite well, actually. My first January like this, I spent in bed. I didn't shower, I didn't dress, I barely ate. By the end of the month, I was getting out of bed, but only to bring back books from the library. I read books on Buddhism, Hinduism, existentialism. I read Hawking, McTaggart, Kant, Leibniz, the ancient Greeks. I read H.G. Wells' goddamn Time Machine, and none of it helped. If anything, it made things worse because I became confused, paralyzed, too scared to try anything. I went back to bed for another month, and I didn't snap out of it until my husband started talking about Jean McGregor. Olive felt humbled. A part of her had always secretly admired the complete abandon with which some people could break down and wallow in their misfortune. Whenever Kerrigan broke up with a boyfriend, she called in sick to work and camped out on the couch for several days, watching the soap network and eating canned pineapple. But Olive liked to be clean and eat regular meals and keep busy. Moving forward as though nothing had happened was her preferred method of coping. The fact that it hadn't occurred to her to look in a book for the answers made her feel dim-witted. She knew who Stephen Hawking was, but couldn't imagine wading through one of his scientific texts. The other names Sherry listed were only vaguely familiar to her. But what struck her the most was that Sherry had assumed she was weeping out of exhaustion and frustration from the overwhelming prospect of reliving the year, which had blissfully, fleetingly left Olive's mind for a moment. She had been crying for Phil, the way she had hurt him, and her disappointment over how things had turned out for him. You're doing all right, Sherry repeated. You're already light years ahead of where I was. You went to work today, right? That's good. She twisted the tassels of her shawl around her fingers. So you had issues with your husband. What else went wrong last year? Boyfriend, Olive corrected. And I don't really know. You'd think it would be obvious. Sherry frowned. Obvious to others, perhaps. It's easy to point out someone else's mistake, harder to recognize your own, especially because most people, except the lucky few like ourselves, are forced to live with their mistakes. So they learn to justify their mistakes, build on them, until they can look back and convince themselves that their mistake was inevitable all along, a good choice, in fact. An unwed teenage mother can look back at her unexpected pregnancy fondly 6 years down the road once the child's out of her hair and in school all day. She wouldn't dare go back and fix that mistake because it's become part of her life. Olive didn't know how to respond. Was Sherry talking of her own past? She folded the damp handkerchief into a triangle. I'm not sure You need to think of this as an opportunity, a blessing, a second chance, not an inconvenience and a curse, Sherry said. I know it can be difficult. I remember how frustrating, how absolutely heartrending the experience can be. In 2005, I had to watch my mother die 3 times. She bowed her head and looked down at her hands. I hope 2011 doesn't hold anything that awful in store for you. Olive thought of her dad. Why hadn't she been given the chance to relive 2008? She thought of the patients she had lost last year, the ones who had inspired her to cut out obituaries and keep the small rectangles of newsprint on her nightstand. She wanted to move to the couch and sit beside Sherry, but Sherry's earlier comment about being bosom buddies made her wary. I'm really sorry, Sherry. That is neither here nor there. What you need to do now is retrace your year to the best of your memory, find the sticking points, and figure out a way to straighten them out. Sherry raised her head, and Olive saw that there was no hint of tears in her eyes. If only it were as easy as Sherry made it sound, as if Olive could simply sketch a map of her year, all 12 months, 365 days, 8,760 hours, in pencil, and label the catastrophes like little landmines, mark them with red pushpins. If she re-examined her year closely now, every word she had said, every action she had done would become suspect. Had she really made her mom cry the day of her wedding when she'd suggested her mom loved Harry more than she'd ever loved her dad? Had she really moved out on Kerrigan and left her with a rent so steep she'd been forced to move in with her sister? She would mark the weekend trip to Lake Geneva with Phil and the subsequent week in February with a white flag. She felt such shame. Perhaps what Sherry had said was right. It was far easier to resign yourself to your mistakes and move on than acknowledge and try to rectify them. Thank you. So at this point, I would love to answer any questions that you guys have. There are no stupid questions, so if you want to talk to me about publishing, about my writing process, anything is fair game.
What's the name of the book for agents that you're talking about?
Oh, that is published by Writer's Digest, and it's called Guide to Literary Agents. Other books that are really helpful are the Writer's Market series. Have you guys heard of those before? They come out with one every year, and they have them according to genre. So there's one for children's book writers, there's one for poets, there's one for nonfiction writers. The one that I had when I was sending out short stories is the Novel and Short Story Writers Market. Do they? Yeah. And a lot of times your local library will have those, and they're usually in the reference section, though, so I don't think you can check them out, but you can purchase one as well. Oh, they do? Excellent. The big one for all? Okay, good. Yeah. Yeah, so I have an older one. I wouldn't buy one every year, buy one. And then anytime you're looking at an entry in there, like an agent or a literary magazine, I would always say go to their website. Always check them out and make sure that they're still in business, they're still there, their submission guidelines, all that kind of stuff. Always cross-check with the internet.
Did you find that the Writer's Digest and literary agents had more agents in the
I think it did. I think because the writer's market has different sections in it. It has literary magazines, online publishers, and different things that their section is maybe a little bit smaller. whereas the Literary Agent Guide is like the whole book is devoted to that. Any other questions? Yeah.
How did you choose to go down the traditional route of publishing instead of self-publishing? How did you make that decision?
That's a good question. So I went to the University of Michigan for graduate school, and while I was there, they were wonderful and brought in a lot of different agents and editors. So I guess that was just kind of the path that I was already set on. For a lot of people, the decision to self-publish or try the conventional route has to do with what your goals are. Are you really just eager to see your work in print and to share it with family and friends? Are you trying for a wider readership? It's kind of a difference between printing and publishing. So printing is making the book available, binding it, or doing it electronically, where publishing is the whole package, where they're going to help you find, the blurbs that go on the front cover of other authors. They're going to send your book out to trade magazines and reviewers. So you get a little bit more support through the traditional route. I think maybe eventually, if I had gone on long enough with so much rejection, I maybe would have eventually tried the self-publishing route. But I know some people think about it right away, and for them, that's the way to go. Did that answer your question? Okay, great. Back here and then over here.
When in your journey of writing and publishing did you first start your blog platform?
Good question.
Those things never existed 15 years ago.
Yeah, they're very new, and it's definitely kind of that wild frontier out there. For me, I hadn't really done much on the internet at all. I wasn't even really much of a Facebook user from someone of my generation. So when I signed the book deal, my agent and my editor said, "You really should have an author website. You really should be using Facebook. You should be posting on it twice a week." And I was like, twice a week? What am I going to say twice a week? It seemed so daunting at first. A lot of authors will have blogs. There's Twitter. I haven't used Twitter yet, but I've heard that's great for writers. So there's all sorts of different stuff you can do. Goodreads is one of my favorite for those of you who have used that website. So there's lots of stuff out there. I hadn't done any of it prior to having my book contract.
So your agent took your manuscript without asking to see your copy?
Yes. So she did not know much about me at all, except for my education background and my manuscript. I didn't really exist on the internet. Yeah, so I know that is something that a lot of people are trying. I did hear something though, that starting a blog is not always the way. I wish I had the statistic for you, but I just read somewhere that there are actually more blogs created every day than books published. And so you might have more competition to get readers to read your blog than you would to have them read your book. So it's not necessarily the magic bullet that's going to fix everything. But if you are someone who has some sort of unique angle, rather than maybe just like the day-to-day musings, or if you collaborated with other writers to have like a multiple blog where you alternated posts, that would probably be a good idea. Do you still have
Do you write in longhand? Do you write just computer?
I personally always use my computer. I love when people write longhand. I think that's so wonderful. For me, it's more I can type faster than I can write. And when I'm having those really great moments where the words are just flowing, I like to be able to type faster.
So if you're somewhere where you don't have really stick notes?
I do, yeah. So it is helpful to have, I usually find by my bedside, it's nice to have a little notebook for those, 3 a.m., wonderful ideas that you have, or they seem wonderful at 3 a.m., and you look at your scribbled notes in the morning, and you're like, what was I thinking? This is really random. But yeah, so I mostly just scribble down notes when I'm away from my computer. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Did you have to write a proposal letter?
So for nonfiction, typically what you would do would be to write that book proposal. For fiction, a lot of agents are kind of asking for you to have your book totally finished, to have your draft as revised and as polished as you can. They're not willing to take as many risks these days as they used to be. So in the past, you maybe would have a draft in progress, and they liked it, they thought it had potential, they'd be willing to edit it with you. These days, it seems like they really want the book to be totally finished, at least for a new author. So I had the draft finished. I sent out a query letter, which basically has like a 3 to 5 sentence, really catchy synopsis of the book. That, think like, you know, the book cover jacket. You know, you're standing in a bookstore, you're standing in a library, you pick it up, you read, and you go, ooh, yeah, I'm gonna buy this, or I'm gonna check this out. So that's challenging to write, to try to distill your book to, you know, that catchy book jacket copy. But basically just a letter that kind of introduces yourself, introduces your book. Some agents are willing to have you send a first chapter initially. Some don't want anything, they just want the query letter. And then if they're interested, if they find your synopsis compelling, then they'll ask you to send either the first few chapters, the first 50 pages, and then from there, hopefully, fingers crossed, they'll want to see more.
Yeah, I kind of talked to you a little bit. So when you sent these out, you did send to
I did. Agents, I did. Yeah, so some people are lucky, and they query a couple agents, and they get one right away. That was not me. What a good problem to have. Yeah.
They keep wanting you at writer's market, you know.
Right? Too many people want me. I wish that was a problem I had. So I would say in the case that you did have simultaneous submissions, if you're just querying them, I think that's fine. But if agents have the manuscript, you should let them know. So sometimes the agents will say, do I have an exclusive on this? Like they want to know, am I the only one who has this right now? And you should tell them the truth, and you should say either, yes, you are, or no, someone else is looking at it. I did have that happen a few times, and typically when I said, no, someone else has it, they would say, oh, just let me know before you make any decisions. So they would want to be kept in the loop of, if I'm going to decide, oh, this person offered me representation, I should tell them so that they could quick scramble to read it and decide if they wanted to offer me representation. The etiquette is just, if you do get an offer, you know, to let them know, to say, you know, I do have an offer of representation. Are you interested? And they'll say, yes, let me keep reading, or no, that's okay.
I just noticed so many writers on the market, they say, when you send publishers, they say, well, I'm submissions, and it's like, well, send them out, and they wait 3 to 6 months.
I see that a lot too, and I think it's kind of selfish on the part of the publishers, because they are so slow. Things in the publishing world move so much slower. Like New York time is so different than Midwest time, right? They're so busy. They have, you know, piles and piles of manuscripts. So I think it's unfair of them to ask that you do that, because it probably would take you a good 50 years if you sent it to one place, waited 6 months, they got back to you, sent it to another. You would want to repeat your year, exactly. So,
well, and if the first one gives you a deal and someone comes back later with a deal, what's the worst that you already have a deal, right?
That's true. Yeah. So I guess you should just go ahead and send them.
So would you worry about, like, it's to send out multiple agents, but then the publisher, so it's okay, like, multiple agents. So we'll go through the agent first, and then we'll publish.
So yeah, I'm talking about, you can submit directly to some publishers. Some small presses and independent presses will accept your kind of unsolicited submission, but a lot of the big presses are only agented work. Yeah, that's helpful to know. Yeah, over here?
I'm interested in knowing when you first knew of this love for writing. Did it come parent-inspired, or in school, or were you always just knowing you were going to write?
Thank you for that question. That's a fun question. I've known I wanted to be a writer since I was 8 years old. And I actually owe it to not only my parents, who were really wonderful, avid readers and read to me every night and just really encouraged that love, but also a teacher, an elementary school teacher. Her name is Mrs. Murphy. And I had her for both 3rd grade and 5th grade, not because I was like held back or anything, but because she switched grades. I think maybe to have me again. But we had a little writer's workshop. And so we would have a unit where we would write stories, and we would take it one step farther, and we'd actually publish those little stories. We had classroom moms who would type up the stories, and we'd have little contact paper covers, and then we'd have them in a little library, and you could check them out. And I was on the bestseller list when I was in the 3rd grade. My books were really, really popular. So yeah, I loved reading. I do think before that class, I didn't really know that being a writer was something you could be. I toyed with some other career ideas because, when you say you want to be a writer or an author, it's not like there are wanted ads out there for, published authors. But when I went to the University of Wisconsin and I found out that they had creative writing classes there, I was like, wow, really? This is a thing? You can do this? This is so much fun. So yeah, I've definitely always wanted to be a writer. So it's so exciting to have my dream finally coming true after all this time. Yeah.
You mentioned short stories that you had done.
Yeah.
When you've been looking for agents, did you limit your genre strictly to novels, or did you look for somebody who would also do nonfiction or multiple?
Good question. So I am a novelist through and through. I don't know that I would ever tackle nonfiction, although I have been writing some essays for publicity purposes these past few months. I love the short story. I love reading short stories, but it's not my ideal form. There isn't much of a market for them, unfortunately. Novels are an easier sell than short story collections. But most agents you will find represent different genres. So my agent actually, she represents literary fiction and women's fiction, which is kind of what I'm classified as. But then she also represents like spirituality nonfiction, like fitness nonfiction, and so they all kind of have different tastes. And so you should definitely look for an agent who represents your style of someone you see yourself following that career path of, I might write a book in this area, or YA, or whatever you're thinking. Yeah.
I've looked through the different agent guides and such, and I don't remember seeing any that specifically say that they work with newspaper features or articles. That's my background is newspapers, and I'm discovering the fun of fiction. But, I've still got other things that I'd like to get published, but sending them directly is a real pain.
Yeah.
If an agent can save me the blood, sweat, and tears.
Yeah. I don't know off the top of my head if agents do represent that. I know they will do, like magazine features. Another resource I would recommend for you guys is the website agentquery.com. And you can actually do searches and click, what type of genre of either fiction or nonfiction, and it'll find agents for you that represent that, and it'll have their contact information. I think sometimes at a certain point you need to buy a subscription for it, but I've always found that you can get enough free searches that I've never had to buy one. But so that's agentquery.com is one that I like. Over here.
Do you have an agent that stay with you then?
Question. So typically you're just kind of agreeing to work with them for that one book, unless you have a 2-book deal. In my case, it was just a 1-book deal. And it's kind of a trial period for both of you. You're seeing, do we like working together? Did you sell my book? Am I happy with how things are going? A lot of people will stay with their agent, forever, and it's, the perfect marriage. They're happy for a long time. Some people hop around. Some people, maybe try a different style of writing. Like maybe you start off with women's fiction, and then you want to do a YA novel. Maybe your agent doesn't represent that, so maybe you try a different agent. maybe your agent retires and then you have to find a new one. So ideally, you'll stick with the same one, but there definitely are situations where you kind of amicably part ways. Or maybe not so amicably, I don't know. Over here?
Andrea, I noticed that you've been very active promoting your book in a whole variety of ways. I see your stuff all over the place.
I'm glad, it's working.
Yeah, it's working. Are you doing that because you think that you should do that, or did your agent say do these kinds of things? Like this book tour, too. Is your agent arranging that, or are you setting that?
Good question. So I have an agent, an editor, and a publicist, and they all have different roles in the world of publishing. The publicist is the one who helps you arrange the news coverage, helps you set up the book tour, helps you get in magazines, all that kind of good stuff. And they definitely did encourage me to do a lot of stuff. There's so many writers out there, and the publishing companies can't afford to send you on, a book tour across the U.S., which would be super fun and glamorous, but isn't the way things are these days. It doesn't really pay off either, too, I think, to go to so many locations. It's kind of nice to stay local. So they encouraged me. I am really invested in the success of the book, too, so I've obviously been working really hard to kind of get the word out there, too. So now I just have to kind of cross my fingers and hope it all pays off and it'll get into the hands of readers who like it. Spread the word. What about book reviews?
How do you get various people to review your book?
Yeah, so my publicist, again, sends it to trade magazines like Kirkus and RT Reviews, Library Journal. She sent it to different authors who could, blurb it and give me advance praise. It's kind of been democratized, too, by websites like Amazon and Goodreads and just people who have blogs and review books. And so there's kind of these different levels of these, trade magazines or New York Times book reviews, and then just readers who have a voice too, which I think is kind of cool. I've heard that you should only read the good reviews and ignore the bad reviews. Since it's only 1 week into the repeat year being out, there aren't a ton of reviews yet, so I'm hoping to get some more positive ones soon.
Actually, we have quite a few online.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
And they were good.
5 stars?
Well, you don't read, but they don't do 5. They just do 4.
Right,
You know,
4.5.
Always read the review.
Any other questions? Yeah, over here.
How are agents, publicists reimbursed? Is it a commission off the sale of the book? And how is that determined?
Good question. So agents typically will make 15% for national book sales off of whatever money you make. I think it's 20% for foreign rights if they sell the books to other countries. The repeat year is going to be published in German in fall 2014. I'm really excited about that. And then I think movie rights is maybe like 15%. The idea being that, they work really hard for you because it's their money too. If they don't sell it, they don't make anything either. I'm not sure how. I think editors and editors and publicists are paid in a different way. It's only the agent who's directly, they're your advocate. They're the person trying to sell your book. Over here and then here.
If this were a movie, you'd like to put out.
Oh, I don't know. I feel like there aren't any actresses out there right now that I could see being cast as her. My agent and I were talking about it on the phone, and she suggested Carey Mulligan. I don't know if you are familiar with her. She's a British actress. She's actually Daisy in The Great Gatsby, the new version that just came out. She's blonde in that movie, though, but I think she's typically brunette. I like her as an actress. She's not my Olive, but I think it would be really fun to see who they would cast if it became a movie. Yeah.
How do you find a publicist? Is that through an agent?
So typically, a publishing company will assign a publicist to you. They have in-house publicists. So, Berkeley, which is my publishing company, they're an imprint of Penguin. They assigned me. Her name is Caitlin, and so she has, a book list of all the other books that are coming out, and so that was nice. But you don't have to worry so much about that. Some people do also decide to hire freelance publicists to work in conjunction with the in-house publicist. You can get a little bit more time and attention that way. Yeah.
How much control or input did you have on your book cover and artwork?
Good question. So this final cover was not the first cover that they showed me. I hated the first cover. It had a woman's legs in like high boots and a dog on the front of it. The dog was looking up at her. And I was like, what is this? This is not my book. This is like, it looked so chick lit. It looked really kind of fluffy. It looked like the story of a girl and a dog. I was really unhappy with it. I didn't know how much power I had as a debut author to say, I hate this. And so I talked to my agent, and I was like, I really, 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 really don't like this cover. And she's like, oh, really? I like it. And so we talked about it, and she said, well, let's talk to your editor, and let's let her know your feelings. So I think I had like a day or two to kind of, stop being so upset about it so I could talk calmly about it to her on the phone. And we had a really nice conversation. They don't want you to be miserable. They want you to be happy too. But she did suggest that I look at a few more book covers, see what types of women's fiction covers are out there. Obviously, the marketing and the art department know more about what sells than what authors do. So I had to put my trust in them a little bit. I wanted a cover that had more to do with the idea of the repeat year. And so that's why I was really excited when they came up with this kind of mirror reflection. It's kind of disorienting when you look at it, which I think is how Olive feels when she first realizes she's reliving the year. It also, I think, kind of hints at more of the romance that's an important point of the book. So I was a lot happier with the second version. But I think if I had said again, oh, I hate it, they probably would have stopped my veto power at that point. I probably would have used it up. So you get some input, but not a ton. Mm-hmm.
Is your agent local or in the state?
She's in New York City. So most of the publishing world is in New York. There are some people in California, and because of the internet and how we can communicate with each other so much easier, there are some Midwestern, and of course there are some small presses in the Midwest. But yeah, I've never met her in person. We've only talked on the phone and over email. I can't wait to meet her one day. Hopefully I can have like a trip out to New York and meet her and my editor and everybody who's been working so hard for me. It would be nice. Mm-hmm.
An agent takes care of all the paperwork, the legal stuff, and all that.
Yep. So she would, send me FedEx me contracts and stuff back and forth. I would get packages in the mail from New York City. I would be so excited. Yes, she is invaluable. She's been really, really wonderful. Mm-hmm.
Going back, when you sent me out your did you always send them through mail or did you ever email them too?
Oh, good question. So a lot of agents, thankfully, are accepting email queries. Mm-hmm. It is legitimate. You just want to find out what their preferred method is and then contact them in that way. You don't want to, call them up or email them at their personal email address. If there's, a lot of times there will be like a query at whatever the agency's name.com is. And that'll be kind of the slush pile. And then, the interns or whoever will pass it on. So sometimes there will be a submission form on the website where you actually just send it that way. Sometimes it's an email. Some still do snail mail, and that's the preferred way that they have.
Did you ever worry when you were setting up with your manuscript about
I didn't. The places that you hopefully are sending it to are trustworthy, and if they're rejecting you, they're tossing it in the garbage. They're not going to go try to publish it themselves. I did keep worrying. So, I've been writing this for such a long time. I kept worrying that there was going to be another book that would come out with this premise, and then I would be like in the shadow of some other book. So I was so glad that I know Kate Atkinson's Life After Life is kind of a popular book right now, but that's totally different than this. So I kept being like, please, 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 someone don't, like, just, not that they would steal my idea, but that they would, come up with a variation of it. So I was really glad that didn't happen. Nope, never did that. It's too expensive anyway, as it is. When you're like printing off that and then you're mailing it, it adds up quite a bit.
Well, along with the comment about the blog and the online presence, that's one thing that I have thought about. How much do you want to put out there regarding your writing on the internet before editors and agents are seeing your work? Because that would be so easy. I find that a really awkward balance of, are you going to establish an online presence when you're writing?
If you're giving away too much of it for free.
So I don't quite understand what they're expecting when they say, and I've read the same thing, do you have a blog? What's your platform? What are you doing to promote yourself and your projects? Well, if you are fledgling,
how do you do that?
I don't understand that.
I would suggest not putting too much of your work available online. There are other types of blogs out there besides just where you're, showcasing your own writing. One writer whose blog, I like a lot of different writing blogs, but they will like interview other writers, right? So they'll kind of set up a platform where they're making connections with other writers in their genre. They're having them do guest posts. They're doing interviews with them. They're reviewing their books. So there are other things that you can do besides just do your own writing. There are cases, a book I just read is called What to Do Before Your Book Launch. That was kind of a helpful book. And the women who wrote the book, Randy Susan Myers, and I cannot remember the other woman's name, they had a blog that had a lot of those tips on their blog, but they didn't give it all away. They still had, enough features that a publishing company wanted to compile their tips, add some more, and publish it. So I feel like, if you are giving them just a little taste of it, but not giving it all away, then that would probably be the right amount. Yeah, maybe just a couple more questions.
Before you published, before you connected with an agent, did you go to a lot of writers' conferences and such?
I went to a few writers' conferences because I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan. I kind of found my community there in my classmates and my professors. I did go to AWP one year when it was in New York City. I think networking with other writers is really, really important. However you do that, if that's going to conferences or retreats, if that's pursuing a graduate degree, if that's meeting at your local library and being in a writer's group, I think it's super, super important to have like that fellowship. Because it's so lonely writing, we need to have people to cheer us on and to give us good constructive criticism. So yeah, however you do it, if it's paying to go to a conference or a convention, if it's just having a coffee with friends, it's important. Maybe one last question? Yeah.
Did you have to put a considerable amount of money down just to show good faith? Or how does that process work?
So most publishers will not ask you for any money. In fact, they will pay you money, ideally. So an agent should not be asking you for any money up front. The only thing that they might charge you for would maybe be like shipping costs or mailing costs or printing costs, but it probably shouldn't be more than $50 to $100, and it should be agreed upon between the two of you. My agent didn't ask me to pay for anything, though. So unless you're going the self-publishing route where they say, you know, for this amount of money, we will do this, this, and this for you, you probably won't be paying anything. Except, you know, your printer paper and your stamps and all that you are doing to send it out. Okay, well, you guys have been a great audience. Thank you so much for coming. Again, shameless self-promotion, books for sale at the back. And I have my special signing pen. So if you do buy a book, I'm happy to autograph it for you. Thank you guys so much.